I can assure you that one of those devotional leaders is taken, so I'm sure that she would not appreciate the offer, Coach Merle. But no, I'm joking. But the other is not. I'm just throwing that out there. All right, so I asked, because, guys, it's after lunch. Everybody's tired. I'm tired. I was yawning, and I want to take a nap, but I can't because I'm speaking to you guys. So, but in all seriousness, I know everybody's tired, but we are talking about important things. And I know that Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. And for those of you who get that reference. But seriously, I have prayed that we'll get something out of this, because I know this is, ever since I was assigned this time, I know it's a difficult time to speak. So I asked Mr. Richter if he had some suggestions of things to do to get you guys awake and going. He suggested laughing. I was like, okay, so let's try it, you know. Everybody just say, ha, 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 Mr. Klein. Okay, see, I knew it would spark some actual laughter, huh? All right. Hopefully that'll keep you awake for another 2 minutes. All right. We've been talking about illusions. So I want to ask you guys, what is an illusion? Those of you who have heard me speak, you know that I like to define things, and I always start off like that. But what is an illusion? Okay, something that appears to be there or exist, but actually does not. All right, I think that's a pretty good definition. Anybody got anything else to add to that? Okay. The actual definition that I had, something that is likely to be wrongly perceived or interpreted by the senses. So I think that incorporates what Paul said pretty well. But something that is likely to be wrongly perceived. That's a key word there. One of the first things I think of when I hear the word illusion, let's see if this is working. Okay. All right. One of the first things I think of when I hear the word illusion, how many of you guys have ever seen the movie The Illusionist? Anybody seen that movie? Okay. Maybe like 2 or 3 people. So maybe you can guess what the movie's about. It's about a magician. And what do magicians do? What is their work based around? I'm sorry? Deceptions, illusions, right? Their whole purpose is to trick you, to thinking that you're seeing something that you're actually not really seeing, right? Their whole purpose is to try to get you to believe that the trick that they're doing is real. Now, would an illusionist or a magician be very good at their job if you could easily see the trick? I'm sure some of you have heard or seen maybe magicians, maybe your dad or your granddad, who did the coin thing behind your ear. You know, it's a classic go-to magic trick that nobody ever believes except for like anyone under the age of 2. So obviously that's not a very good magic trick, right? Not a very good illusion. For us to believe, though, that the illusions of our culture, as we've been talking about so far last night and today, are easily perceived, it's foolish, isn't it? It's foolish. Because Satan is a really good illusionist, isn't he? And sin is a really good illusion. And so for us to think that we're always going to easily see straight through that sin to the truth of the matter, what's really going on, that's very foolish of us to act that way or to believe that. The only way for us to properly expose an illusion of this world is to what? What do we go to? I like how Mr. Klein said it last night. Who is the ultimate revealer of truth? God. Talking about, you said something to the effect of Satan being a great liar, great at deceiving someone. But God is great at revealing truth. And I love the way you said that, because it's so true. that the only way that we're going to expose the illusions for what they really are is for us to go to the truth, for us to go to God, right? So, truth and truth alone can bring to light the true nature of an illusion. And if our desire, let me get through this, I always get behind my slides every time. If our desire is to see the illusions of our culture, then we must rely on the truth to expose them, right? There are a lot of people in this world caught up in the illusions of life, illusions of sin. And you know what they need? They need someone to show them truth. And when people first see that truth for the first time ever, people who didn't grow up in the church like a lot of us did, people who see the truth and believe it, it's like a whole new world has been opened up to them. They finally see what's really going on behind the illusion. Look at Ephesians chapter 5, verses 11 through 14. We play a key role, guys, in us understanding and seeing through the illusions of this world, and for other people coming to that light and seeing the truth and seeing the true illusions of this world for what they really are. Okay? And Ephesians 5, verses 11 through 14 talks about that. It says, "Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead," what? "Expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, 'Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.'" Okay. It's our responsibility. I want to emphasize this. It's our responsibility to expose the illusions for what they really are. But if we're not going to the light, if we're not going to Christ who shines on us, as Paul talks about in verse 14, if we're not going to the light, we're not going to Christ, how are we ever going to expose the darkness for what it really is? And I always think about, in John chapter 3, when Jesus talks about those who love the darkness and how they hate going to the light because they know that their deeds are going to be exposed as not being done in God. You guys remember that passage? How important is it, if we really believe that we love God and we really want to serve Him, how important is it that we frequently come back to the truth, exposing our sin for what it really is, and seeing God and His truth face to face, and exposing, ultimately, the illusions of our culture, like we're talking about today. So, expanding on that, maybe a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I think it's important for us to kind of establish in our heart the seriousness of the illusions of our culture, and that it's our responsibility to expose these things for what they really are. So, getting into the topic of my lesson here. There's a certain seriousness that comes with our tongues. And people in the world aren't going to tell you this. People in the world think that talking is just talking. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. There's, surely, they understand that there are words that hurt and things like that, but there's no real eternal consequence to the words that you use. But let me tell you guys, God says the total opposite of that. James chapter 1, verse 26. Listen to this. And as I was studying for this lesson, it didn't hit me. This verse didn't hit me until I was studying for this lesson, as hard as it does. James chapter 1, verse 26. Someone read that for me, please. Okay. You're a good person. You love God. You do your best to serve Him. You go to church every Sunday. You go to church every Wednesday. You go to Bible studies outside of church. You know what? You go out and you serve people and you help them, but you don't bridle your tongue. What does James say? everything else that you've been doing is worthless. And this verse hit me hard because I thought, of all the things, that God says we don't really work on, and there's a lot of things, but that we don't really work on or try to control in our lives, it makes our religion worthless. Who would have thought that it would be the tongue that God mentions here? And again, there are other things in our life, sins in our life that can keep us out of eternal life. I'm not trying to say that. But to me, it's significant enough in God's mind to mention that if we don't work on bridling our tongue, if we don't see our tongue as a serious tool for good or for evil, then we're doing ourselves a disservice. And ultimately, we're putting ourselves in a very compromisable, is that a word? Position for eternal life or for eternity. Proverbs chapter 8, verse 13. Someone read that for me. Proverbs 8:13. What time do I go till? Okay. Proverbs 8:13. Someone please read that for me. Perverted speech I hate. Anybody have any different translation of that? That's the ESV. Anything else? Anything different? Okay, the perverse mouth. Again, God takes seriously how we use our tongues. And he says he hates perverted speech. He hates it. Not just dislikes it, not just, it turns him off. He hates it. Matthew chapter 12, verses 36 through 37. Matthew 12, 36 and 37. Getting behind on my slides again. Someone read that for me. Okay. Again, if we don't think that our words have eternal weight, we're making a big mistake. And right now is the time for us to consider, how are we using our tongues? We're talking about it right now. Right now, examine yourself. How am I using my tongue? Do I consider my words as having an eternal consequence? It is vital that we recognize the seriousness of our speech. All right. So kind of moving into one of these illusions. Again, we've been talking about illusions of our culture. Let me just ask you guys, what is an illusion that our culture presents before us of speech, concerning our speech? And if you have the folder, if you're open up from the folder, you'll see where I'm going with this, but I just want to get what you guys think. What's a big illusion? Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going with this. Our country tells us freedom of speech is a way to use our tongues. And they've led us to believe this so much so that it means that we can practice it without concern for others, and we can practice it without concern for the consequences of what we say. Haven't people come to believe that? That freedom of speech means you can say whatever you want? That's pretty sad, isn't it? And I would venture to say that our forefathers never intended or would have intended freedom of speech to be taken to that degree. But of course, men are men, and we take things to the farthest degree as we can. And so we've come to accept and tell this lie that we can say whatever we want. Proverbs 21 verse 23 says, "Whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble." I'm going to read that again. Whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. Has there ever been a time in your life where you said something at the wrong time? And maybe you didn't even intend for it to be bad. Maybe you had no bad intentions, but you spoke too soon, or you said something, and then something bad happens as a result. Maybe feelings get hurt, or maybe even something of greater consequence happens. Now, I'm not saying that, we can't ever say anything ever. But what I'm saying is, we need to think before we speak. And that being quiet should come before speaking. And I'm talking to myself here too. We see a lot of people today saying a lot of things that they know very little about under the name of freedom of speech. Where do you see a lot of this going on? This practice of freedom of speech, especially in our culture today with, the wide access we have to everyone's opinion. Where do we see a lot of that? Facebook, any kind of social media. You can see everyone's opinion all over the place. And you see a lot of people talking about things that they know very little about. And you know what? They end up getting themselves into trouble. And then a lot of times they end up making themselves look stupid. On May 5th, 2015 of this year, in Garland, Texas, there was an art contest to see who could draw the craziest pictures of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. And apparently, I didn't know this, that it's a sin or some sort of sin to try to draw a picture of Muhammad in the Islamic religion. And there was an art contest flying in the face of the Islamic religion to see who could draw the best picture of Muhammad. Now, first of all, I think it's very stupid with all the things that are going on in our world today from the Islamic religion to have a contest to make them even more mad than they already are. Second of all, do you think it was very smart of them to do that anyway? I saw this on the news, and Bill O'Reilly, some of you might know who he is. I like Bill O'Reilly for the most part. He's the host of the O'Reilly Factor on Fox News. He said this about those actions. He said, did they have a right? Of course, but it was stupid. He's very blunt sometimes. And similarly, Fox News analyst Laura Ingraham said, there are a lot of things we can say and have a right to say, but we shouldn't say. Proverbs 10 verse 19 says, I already have it up there. It says, in the multitude of words, sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise. Now, this is drawing a picture, right? But again, they did it in the name of freedom of speech. Do you think it was very wise of them to do this action, especially in the name of freedom of speech? No. I think we would all agree that no, it's not. It was stupid. And it's just a prime example of how far our culture has taken this concept of freedom of speech and just used it and abused it without concern for the consequences or anything like that of what they do and what they say. Proverbs 29 verse 20 says, do you see a man hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him. See, those who speak quickly, those who don't hold back their tongues, those who have a feeling in their heart whenever they hear something they don't like and they just start spouting off about it and going off on a rant, people like that, they don't get very far in life if they continue to hold that quality. Because they just spout off. And I know every one of us has been around someone like that, and maybe we've done that. I know I've done that at times, where you just start ranting about something or whatever, they just fly off, out of your emotion. You say something, and you find quickly that these proverbial writings are true, that in the multitude of words, sin is not lacking. And you find very quickly that if I had just kept my mouth, if I had just kept my tongue, I would have kept myself out of trouble. Freedom of speech, it's not an excuse to say whatever we want, whenever we want. Don't believe that illusion, that lie from our culture. Don't believe that God wants you to say whatever you think or whatever you feel. Because it's not true. Soren Kierkegaard, I don't know how to say the name, said that people demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought, which they seldom use. Isn't that true? And the reason I'm harping on this so much is because it's such an illusion from our culture. It's such a lie from our culture to think that we can just say whatever we want. And for us to believe that God would want us to use our tongues like that is foolish. When we put our right of freedom of speech above our responsibility of control, we're in serious trouble. Proverbs 18 and verse 13. Someone read that verse for me, please. Proverbs 18:13. Someone who hasn't read, someone read Proverbs 18:13. Okay. Now someone read James 1:19 through 21, and this verse goes along with Proverbs 18:13. Someone who hasn't read James 1:19 through 21. What's the disposition of the type of person that practices Proverbs 18:13 and James 1:19 through 21? What do those people look like? Not physically, but in their life. What do they look like? What do you see? In your mind, maybe you think of a specific person, but what do you think of? Anybody? Okay. Yeah. Someone who well, I mean, I guess just saying exactly what the Proverbs and James is saying. Someone who thinks before they speak, right? Who's slow to speech, who listens, who takes in what they're hearing and mulls it over and thinks about it, thinks before they use their words. And I can think of specific people in my life that do that very well. And I'm sure it's taken them time to practice that. But it's vital that we learn to open our ears and close our mouths. And a lot of people in our world today are telling us to open your mouth and close your ears. And that's so not true. So not true. We got to be careful how we understand and how we use or even preach this concept of freedom of speech. And I just kind of going off from my notes here for just a second, I think about what Mr. Windland was talking about last night, this idea of independence. And I just think, if our lives are about subjecting ourselves to Christ, then the concept of independence should be, is totally different from what the world considers it, isn't it? And if we are subjecting ourselves to Christ, then our idea of freedom of speech should be confining our words within the realm of what God wants us to speak. And that's kind of a little bit of a rant, but as we've been going through these lessons, I'm seeing more and more how much of a lie our culture is feeding us and how far we're getting away from what's true about these things. And so, it makes me passionate about it. I hope it does for you guys as well. It's important that we understand that concept of freedom of speech in the right way, as God would want us to. All right. There's something very interesting about words. Words have the power to create. They can create feelings. emotions, lies. They can inspire you. And, it's no wonder to me that God has endowed us, people created in His image, with that same creation ability within our words. Because how did God create the world? How did He create everything that exists as we know it? He spoke. He used His words. And God gave us that same ability. Not that we can speak things into creation, but that our words have creation power. And furthermore, and I have this in my notes here, that it's interesting to me that God didn't give us some kind of movie or pictures, or I wrote on there jokingly, an Instagram account of how He brought about salvation for man. God didn't use images to document His power displayed in times past, but He used words. And it is these words, these powerful words, that have brought you here today. These words are the reason that you're here. You didn't see Jesus. You've never even seen one of the apostles. You've never seen a miracle. But you're here, and you believe in God, and you believe that Jesus is His Son, and you believe in His power. And for you to say, of all people, that words have no power, then you're deceiving yourself. Words have the power to create. But the problem is, how do we often use this power? We have that power as human beings to use our words to create something good, right? We could create someone's belief in God, or help create someone's belief in God. Ultimately, it's not our words, it's God's words that do that. Or we have the power to inspire someone, right? Or motivate somebody. But a lot of times, we find ourselves abusing our creation power. Our power, the power of our words. Proverbs 18 verse 21 says, death and life are in the power of the tongue. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. James 3 verse 8 says, it is a restless evil, talking about the tongue, full of deadly poison. For those of you who don't know, some of you do know this, but I'm a nurse in the CV ICU at Huntsville Hospital. So I work with heart patients, surgical heart patients. And I work closely with these heart surgeons. And I think about this, okay? If those surgeons, well, first of all, death and life are in the power of their hands, right? When they're in surgery. And with that knife that they're cutting with and all the tools, the instruments that they're using, a surgeon has the power, a heart surgeon has the power to heal and the power to kill a human heart right there in his hands. And Proverbs 18 verse 21 is telling us the same thing. That in our tongue, we have the power to kill, and we have the power to bring life to a human heart. But oftentimes, we don't recognize the fact that we have this power. We don't recognize the fact that we have the power to create, that we have the power to heal, to give life, to give death, to poison, as James said it, or to kill. And for any of us to say that we don't struggle with this is a lie, because James chapter 3 verse 2 says, for we all stumble in many ways. And if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body. If you can bridle your whole body perfectly, then maybe you don't have any struggles with how you use your tongue. But most of us can't do that. So we do have a problem with this. And we do misuse the power of our tongue. So then let me ask you this. What are some of the poisonous, deadly tendencies, using the words of James and the proverbial writer? What are some of those poisonous and deadly tendencies of our tongue? Lying. What else? I'm sorry? Degrading others. Putting others down. Gossip. It's a huge one. Cursing. Swearing. I would venture to say that most of us don't struggle with cussing. Some of us might. But I will say that things like crude joking, or lying, or gossip, flattery, that's one we don't think about a lot. Proverbs 26, verse 28 says, "A lying tongue hates its victims, and a flattering mouth works ruin." When you think about flattery, the Bible describes it in a very negative light. Or blasphemy, or disrespect, maybe to our parents, or to our elders, or hatefulness towards others. Are we all guilty of those things with our tongue? That we've misused the power of our tongue. All of these poisons have been portrayed by the illusions of our culture to be acceptable. You know, at work, sometimes I notice, and again, I have no right to necessarily to say, you know, that everyone around me is just a terrible person, because I know I've been guilty of the same thing. But it's like, one moment, you'll hear someone talking nicely to someone else, and then literally as soon as they leave, they turn around and talk about how much they dislike that person. It happens all the time. All the time. It makes me sick that people are so blatantly just fly in the face of the kind of attitude, the kind of way that we should be using our tongue, that's so caught up in this concept that talking about people is okay, that, oh, we're just humans, we're, you know. How many times do we fall into that trap, that illusion, that we can just talk about people however we want? And I think to myself, I try to ask myself, whenever I'm talking about somebody, if they were standing right here, would I want them to hear what I'm saying? Would I say this to their face? And would I say it the way that I'm saying it to their face? Because sometimes you might say, well, I would say this to their face, but you would never say it the way you just said it to someone else to their face, right? You say it maybe in a lighter way to them. And I hear it all the time. And, you know, I mean, men are bad about it, but girls are terrible about it. I'll be honest. And I'm not saying all of you Christian girls, you know, it's different, but worldly girls, it's bad, man. Guys, you know, they kind of have the tendency to say it to your face. They don't care. But girls do it bad. And so what I'm getting at here is we can't get caught up into the illusion that the ways that we misuse our tongues and abuse our creation power, the creation power, I keep going back to that phrase, to the poison, the power to poison, the power to kill. We can't get caught up in the illusion that our tongues don't have this power, because they do. So, how do we become people with poisonous speech? Matthew chapter 15. I gotta hurry. Man, I'm way behind. Matthew 15:11. All right. Jesus says, "It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person." Verses 17 through 20, or 19 or 20. "Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled, but what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person? For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a person." You know, I was talking about how we have that power to kill or give life. And Jesus is saying, like, whatever we're filling our hearts with, if we're filling our hearts with life, if we're filling our hearts with light, as I talked about, or as Paul talks about in Ephesians 5, then what's going to come out? What's going to come out? Light and life, right? And we're feeding our hearts death and darkness and wickedness. What's going to come out? The same thing. Okay? So how do we become people with poisonous speech? We become those kind of people because that's what we're listening to all the time. That's what we're filling our hearts with. We're watching movies. We're listening to music that just fills our hearts with that. You know, we're looking at Instagram all the time and looking at the way people talk about it. We're reading BuzzFeed all the time. You know, we're on Facebook all the time. And we're filling our hearts with all this junk. And so, therefore, we become people that talk junk. So how do we fix that? What's the solution? How to become people with pure speech? David says in Psalm 19 and verse 14, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." In Psalm 49 and verse 3, Psalm 49:3. "My mouth shall speak wisdom, the meditation of my heart shall be understanding." There's a close connection there that David makes in Psalm 19. And that the supposed writers of Psalm 49, sons of Korah, make between the mouth and the meditation of the heart. So how do we become people of pure speech? We meditate on pure things. We think about good things. If our hearts are pure, our speech will be pure as well. If we meditate on the truth, we will be able to unmask the poisonous illusions that our culture creates concerning our speech. So then let me ask you this. What does a pure heart produce? One that has been filled with good things. One that has been meditating on God and on Christ. What does that kind of heart, what kind of fruit does that mouth produce? Ephesians 4 verse 29. Ephesians 4:29. You got to hurry here. "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouth, but only such as is good for building up." Some versions say for edification, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. A heart that's filled with purity puts forth edification. It doesn't tear other people down when they walk away. It builds them up. And when other people are talking bad about other people, that mouth still builds other people up. It edifies. It speaks good things. Keep going ahead, sorry. It also brings forth purity. Colossians chapter 3, verses 8 through 9. "But now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices." In order to remove the earthly that he's talking about here, we must focus on implanting the spiritual, letting the word of Christ that he talks about in verse 16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, letting the words of Jesus change our words, right? Letting Christ's words become my words. Letting his heart become my heart. James 3, verses 9 through 12. With it, talking about our tongues, with it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. That's exactly what I was talking about earlier. That here we are on Sundays, We worship and we sing praises, and then we go out to lunch and we start talking about other people at church, our brethren. These things ought not to be so. And I'm going to harp on this for just a second. That I hear gossip so much. And I've almost heard it sometimes worse in the church. Well, maybe I won't say that because it's not that bad. Because it's pretty stinking bad outside of the church. But I've heard it among brethren bad. I mean, real bad. And I haven't spoken up like I should. I haven't said, hey, let's not, maybe I don't contribute. But guys, this is a problem. And I would say of all the things, above cussing and maybe even lying, which I think we struggle with too sometimes, gossip is a big one. All of us really need to tame. Because with our tongues, we see ourselves blessing our Father, and with our tongues, we see ourselves cursing our brethren. These things ought not to be so. A heart that is pure purifies the waters of his speech. Proverbs 15 and verse 4. A gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. A pure heart produces the fruit of life in their speech. Proverbs 16, verse 24. Gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. This pure heart produces the sweetness of words and health to those who are around him. Have you ever been in just really low, maybe spiritually or even physically, and someone just says something positive to you right at the right time? I remember a friend of mine who I haven't known very long. This was like last year. He's from Texas. He's a preacher out in Texas. And one day, I was going through a time in my life where I was really discouraged. And he texted me randomly. And he texted the words, "You are my smile." Because you remember that song, the church song, "You are my smile." And it was like on a Wednesday or something. So after church, he texted me, "You are my smile." And he said, "This is one of the first things I noticed about you. Keep smiling, brother." And I get choked up. I almost get choked up every time. It was one of the most genuine compliments I've ever received in my life. Seriously. It was very kind. And things like that, don't they bring life to you? They bring health to your bones, sweetness to the soul. It's like eating candy. Seriously. That's what it's like. Use your waters to bring sweetness to other people's lives, to bring health to their life. All right. I'm getting behind. Ephesians 5:4. This is a huge illusion of our day, guys. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. Movies, TV, songs, comedians, etc., filling our minds with crude jokes, immoral humor, people foolishly speaking about things that they don't understand, as we talked about earlier. It's not okay for us to do these things. And then, as I said earlier, Paul is appealing to these Ephesians, though he doesn't directly say it, the concept is there, to think before they speak. Think before you make a joke. Think before you talk about something that you don't know anything about. Or even just speaking your opinion on something you do know a lot about. Think before you speak. I'd like to talk about that more, but I don't have time. So how should we use our tongues? Ephesians 5:4. We don't talk about filthiness, foolish talk, crude joking, but instead let there be thanksgiving. Yes, there are a lot of bad things to talk about. Yes, there are a lot of dirty things we could talk about. But if we're in Christ, then we have every reason to give thanks and talk about to other people why we should be giving thanks, why we are thankful. Use your tongue for thanks. Now let me say this. How will we ever be thankful if we don't acknowledge what God has done for us in our lives? If we don't think about those things, if we don't meditate on those things, then how are we going to give thanks with our tongues, right? So we have to be thinking about, our minds have to be pure, right? We have to be meditating on good things in order for us to be speaking thankfulness to God and showing our thankfulness in our words to other people. A heart that comes face to face with Christ is truly so busy with speaking of Christ and thanking Him that really the thought of evil speech doesn't even cross his mind, doesn't even come into his heart. Because he's come face to face with Jesus. And he's seen and experienced the kindness of God. And then the severity of God. And the goodness of God. That's what he talks about. That's what he thinks about. So where is your heart? Do you bring it into the presence of God? Do you bring yourself closer to the face of Christ so that your words are purified through Him and your life displays this tongue of purity and thanksgiving? Lastly, if we're having problems with this, I encourage you, make an appeal to God for help. Psalm 141, verses 3 through 5. Just a couple more passages and I'll be done. Psalm 141, verses 3 through 5. The Psalm of David, he says, "Set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. Do not let my heart incline to any evil, to busy myself with wicked deeds, in company with men who work iniquity, and let me not eat of their delicacies. Let a righteous man strike me. It is a kindness. Let him rebuke me. It is oil for my head. Let my head not refuse it." There are three things that David prays for here. One, this concept of thinking before he speaks. Set a guard over my mouth. A filter is kind of what I think of. Thinking before he speaks. In verse 4, he's appealing to God to help him keep his heart pure, as we talked about. To let his heart not incline to any evil. And lastly, to help him accept rebuke when it is needed, verse 5. These are very similar prayers, or we should be praying very similar prayers in our own lives. If we're having problems with our tongues, asking God to help us find that filter in the way that we speak, to keep our hearts pure, and to accept rebuke when we need it, right? And then Proverbs 19, verse 14. We read this earlier. "Let the words of my mouth and meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." May the words of our mouth reflect the meditations of our heart in all of its purity. Proverbs 18:21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. How are you going to use that power? How do you use that power today? Thank you guys for your good attention. May we use our words to empower others with life. Thank you. Take a 7-minute break. We'll take a 7-minute break and then we'll come back.